welcome back, history class. This will be really kind of the third thing that you're adding to your like foreign policy notes, or the ones where the first section that I already gave you was America becomes a world power. Then I told you to add stuff that was about the annexation of Hawaii, and this is really kind of like the third chunk that will go on that same notes page. So all three of those sections, after you complete like this video lecture today, will be used for the corresponding quiz. That would be like American foreign policy from the era we're covering. As I said before, like this stuff's been spread out over a week or so probably the first page of notes is a little hazy in your memory. That's why I strongly encourage you to take notes on your own, just jot stuff down, and then use that stuff on the quizzes. Okay, another thing, I've had a few comments that like, man, your lectures are dragging on a little bit long, or, you know, the videos are 20 minutes or so, a lot of them. Keep in mind that I have to basically take up 30 to 45 minutes of your time every day. I know some teachers are posting a lot of assignments like first thing in the week and dumping 20 assignments on you. Other teachers, or some of the upperclassmen teachers, are actually recording 30 or 40 minute videos. I feel like, basically, to break it down, the best way to do it, I want you checking in every day. So I try not to load you up on any given day. You'll always have just like one or two posts for every school day. And then my lectures, I'm trying to keep them to about 15 to 20 minutes a day. Now, I could shorten them up to 5 or 10 minutes and spread it out more, but then I have to come up with other work for you to do. And honestly, I just hate giving you like busy work and worksheets and things like that. So, you know, do these lecture videos, I feel like that's fairly easy. And then you do like the corresponding quiz. That's really what I've got for you to do today. So also, one other thing, some people will, I know, just try to go through and like skip through and see what's on each slide. About half of the quiz questions or my exam questions will be stuff that's like bullet pointed and written, but there's a whole lot of stuff that I actually just say and I'll tell you to write down. Well, that's my way of incentivizing you actually watching the videos and paying attention. And I want to reward the kids that actually do sit and listen to the lectures, because like in normal times, that would be a big part of my class. But there I have you as a captive audience, and you can't really tune out. You got to have your head up and phone down and be paying attention. It's a lot easier to cheat it now, but I really want to reward the people that are sitting there and paying attention to the lectures. Okay, here we go. So kind of the third thing we're adding on to the foreign policy notes, Spanish-American War, which coincidentally, even though it had nothing to do with the annexation of Hawaii, this all panned out in the same year. So our Secretary of State at the time, like after the war was completed, said it was a splendid little war. What he meant by that was it only lasted about 6 months. It was very lopsided. America totally kicked butt. And really, this kind of marks the beginning of like America becoming like an imperial power, where we started to take colonies and more islands abroad. And then, like I said, right at the same time was when we ended up picking up Hawaii, which if you haven't seen that, go back and watch that lecture before taking the quiz too. So here we go. Oops, went too far. Okay, now this slide has quite a bit of information on it. Please know, though, I did boil it down as much as I possibly could. When we get to like World War I or World War II, those wars are much, much bigger, way more complex. We spend more time studying them because they drag on, where this war was like a couple thousand casualties. Both of the world wars are going to be up in the tens of millions of casualties. Much bigger conflicts that have huge ramifications worldwide, and America plays into them. For this one, though, it's a shorter war, but it still has its own interesting story. Where in like World War I, we'll have a whole slideshow. It'll be about 10 slides or so, in probably a 2-part lecture series that'll be all about how that war kicked off, and then more notes on how America got involved. This one, I did boil it down as much as I could, and really the whole lead up to the war is on this one page here. So some key facts for you, just to give you the rundown. So follow along as I am talking to you, and you follow along looking at the slide. Spain had been a huge empire. You go back to like the 1500s, 1600s, they were the dominant country in Europe and probably the strongest country in the world. But that was a long time ago. Now we're in 1898, and Spain had been on the decline for a long time. They've been losing colony after colony after colony, like Mexico. Big chunks of Central and South America used to be part of the Spanish Empire. At this point, by the time you get to around 1900 or so, they have all rebelled and broken free of Spain. So Spain only has 4 colonies left around the world, and they're all islands. or chains of islands. Cuba is one of them. Most of you have probably heard of Cuba before. It's an island that's about 90 miles south of Florida, a big, long, like skinny island. The U.S. even still kind of has tense relations with it today, and we'll get into that whole story down the road. Spain, I guess, was absolutely rotten to the Cubans. They were very brutal to them. They had a lot of plantations and farms. You can almost think of it like American slavery, except the Cuban people weren't technically slaves. They were very poor. They were treated like crap. They were often brutalized and murdered. They hated the Spaniards there dominating them. So not technically slaves, but really not much better off than slaves would be. The Cubans want to get the Spaniards out of there, and they want their independence. So Cuban like rebels that are trying to break away from Spain and follow like the model that Mexico had done years before, they're ready to have like a revolution, but they also know that the Spaniards, even though their empire's in decline, they have guns. They have an actual like military and equipment and stuff. Where these rebels, they've got like machetes and shovels and hatchets and stuff. They don't really have like the weaponry they need to have a revolution and a successful rebellion. So they actually some of these rebels come and approach America and say, hey, how about you help us out? The Spaniards are treating us like crap. We know you Americans are all about freedom and liberty. You guys fought a rebellion a couple hundred years ago against Great Britain. Why don't you help us do the same thing? America, you got help back in the revolution from France. Now's your chance to help us out, kind of pay that good deed forward. America looks at the situation and we say, you know what? Thanks, we get where you're coming from, but we don't really want to get involved in a war. We don't want to get involved in a conflict. It's going to cost American lives. It's going to cost money. It's going to disrupt the balance of power. And for a whole host of reasons, America's just kind of like, we're not really in the business of going around and funding revolutions. The Cubans don't like that, and they don't want to take no for an answer. So, kind of key point, there were a lot of American businessmen that had big sugar plantations in Cuba. So if you think back to the Hawaii notes, we had some rich guys like Sanford Dole that were pineapple farmers there in the Hawaiian Islands. But at the time, Hawaii wasn't part of the United States yet. It had a queen, okay? Similar situation in Cuba where we have some very wealthy businessmen that own these sugar plantation fields down there. And the Cuban rebels are pretty smart, and they realize, you know what? What motivates Americans? America's all about business and money and, making that profit and stuff. And they care about American interests abroad, even if it doesn't directly impact like the U.S. military or government. The government is closely connected to like powerful U.S. business interests. So they start burning American-owned farms and plantations in Cuba, even though those American farmers had done nothing to them. That does stir the pot a little bit. It gets those rich American farmers that had their property destroyed. They start calling their congressmen and politicians and say, what the heck? My property's being destroyed there. It's ruining my business. I want the U.S. government to, even though this isn't U.S. territory, I want you to defend my interest and have my back here. America is still at that point like, well, we're not really going to get into a war over this. It wasn't like America was directly attacked. But we do take a little bit more interest in, and we want to flex our muscles a little bit and basically tell them to knock that crap off. So we send one of our newest battleships at the time, the USS Maine. That's a key word there, the USS Maine, a battleship. We send it down there and park it in Havana Harbor, and we basically are sending the message. We don't start shooting at the Spanish or the rebels or anybody, but we're sending a strong message to the Spanish authorities that run the island that, hey, we're watching you. You better keep an eye on things or we might get involved. The Spaniards don't like that. That kind of irks them. You wouldn't want some powerful, we wouldn't like it if China came over here and had like some battleships over in San Francisco keeping an eye on us. It's kind of, it's a veiled threat, even though we didn't directly take action at that time. Well, the USS Maine one night after it had been parked down there a while explodes. It blows up in the middle of Havana Harbor. I guess it was quite a fireworks show because the powder magazines, like where all the shells are stored, somehow a spark got in there and it ignited and it just blew up. And they said that like people that were like 5 miles away, that were just outstanding by the harbor at night out on the beach got blown off their feet and knocked 5-10 feet back. I guess it was so loud you could hear it like 40-50 miles away. This massive explosion that lights up the night sky. Basically, every sailor on the USS Maine died. I think 2 guys that were up on the deck got blown off into the water and did get rescued by a boat, but the whole ship just goes right up. Our initial reaction is that Spain must have done this. They must have put mines out there at night or sabotaged that ship or come up and shot it and hit into the powder magazines when we weren't looking. Hindsight now, looking back on it through history, we have since, and this didn't get really discovered until after the war was already fought and we had won, but we realized that actually that designed battleship, which was a new one at the time, had a faulty boiler. And now we are like 99% certain that Spain actually had nothing to do with it, neither did the Cuban rebels, that it was actually just a faulty boiler that overheated, and then the boiler overheated and a fire caught in the belly of the ship, and then somehow that fire spread to where the weapons storage was, and the whole thing just, boom, went up. But at the time, we didn't know that. And American newspapers, who had been kind of wanting a war anyway, and most of the newspapers were controlled by this one guy, William Randolph Hearst. I think he owned like 60% of the newspapers in the country. He starts putting out these sensational headlines in all of his newspapers around the country. Here's a couple examples of them, and this would be called yellow journalism. It's where you're doing reporting, but it's kind of similar to like a propaganda where all of his newspapers had stories the next day that Spain attacks our battleship, the USS Maine blows up, these salacious headlines that are just very sensational. And they are reporting on something true, but they're doing it in a very inflammatory way. They're getting people riled up and fired up. And often it's way over exaggerated too. So make sure you know what yellow journalism is. That'll come up on the quiz, and I'll for sure have that on the Q1 exam. So the USS Maine exploding, combined with the way it was reported to the American people, gets the American people just fired up. And overwhelmingly, most people in the country, they say, we demand we go to war with Spain. We want to avenge the Maine. Okay, so it's like we're going to get revenge for all those sailors that we think Spain killed out on that boat. Now, poor Spain is like, wait, we had nothing to do with it. They're trying to like reason with us and talk to us, but because American public opinion goes so far in one direction and people are convinced that Spain did this, they're demanding action. All right. So the Spanish-American War, now that the war is actually, America declares war on Spain. Here's the breakdown in a nutshell. We've been talking about TR, or Teddy Roosevelt, quite a bit. After I got through this part of it, probably tomorrow or the next day, I'm going to add part 3 of the Teddy Roosevelt biography. Roosevelt actually plays in and becomes one of the stars of this war. Now, ahead of the Spanish-American War, and I'll get into this in more detail on the Roosevelt notes, but Roosevelt had come back from being out west, and he got back into politics, and he had climbed up through. He wasn't in an elected office, but he was the Secretary of the Navy. So essentially, the only person he would report to is the president, and he is like the top dude in the Navy. He's not technically like an admiral or an officer or anything, but all of the admirals and officers and top-ranking Navy brass would report to the Secretary of the Navy, and then the Secretary of the Navy reports to the president. Roosevelt now had been thinking a war was going to break out for quite a while. And he was one of the people that wanted a war. So he had our Navy super well prepared. He had been stocking our ships full of fuel, full of ammunition. We have new, really the second best Navy in the world next to Great Britain. Our Navy is far superior to the Spanish Navy. And Roosevelt, in large part, because he had been seeing this war coming up and he had been itching for it and wanting the war, he had our Navy super well prepared. So this war takes place on a couple different fronts, but there's really 3 battles in the war, and they all go super quick, and America decisively wins all of them. Out in the Pacific Ocean, because Spain has a few islands in the Caribbean, by Florida, and then they have a couple other islands that are way over across the world out by Asia, kind of by Japan and China, far across the Pacific. So this first part of the battle, or the war, takes place out in the Pacific. And then the next slide, I'm going to bounce around to what was going on in Cuba. Our Pacific fleet sails to the Philippines, which is one of 2 islands that the Spaniards controlled out in the Pacific. The U.S. Navy now, like I had said, is very modern. We have steel battleships with big 10-inch guns that can fire like 18 miles. The Spanish Navy is like, they mostly have steel ships, but they actually have some that are still like wooden ships in their fleet. In comparison, their Navy was not getting ready for war. Their ships were not all fueled up. And they have much smaller guns on the decks of their ships. So, like, to give you the contrast there, American naval cannons at the time, our best ones, can fire about 18 miles. Not super accurate, but that's how far away you can fire shells and expect to possibly hit like an enemy ship. In contrast, the Spanish ships can only fire about 3 miles. So this, you can see how like two fleets with those different like kind of dynamics or stats playing out, it is a setup for a real lopsided battle. So we end up tracking the Spanish Navy down in Manila Harbor, which is out in the Philippines, one of their territories out there in the Pacific. We basically pull up in our range, but out of their range. And in a couple-hour battle in one day, we sink all of the Spanish ships because, say, like, for example, we're about 10 miles away and we can't like 100% accurately like have every one of our shells hit one of the Spanish ships. Actually, I think I heard a stat that like something like 98% of the shells that our ships fired missed. They just hit the water and were hitting around the Spanish ships. But those 2% of shells that actually did make contact with Spanish ships were absolutely devastating. Now, the Spanish try to fire back at us, but their cannons only go 3 miles, and we're like 10 miles away. So not one American ship took any damage. I think there was one ship that went in a little too close, did get hit by some of the Spanish guns, but the armor on the American ships was so thick that their cannons, actually like the shells just bounced right off our ship and there was zero damage. Within a matter of a couple hours, we sink the entire Spanish Pacific fleet. So that part of the war couldn't have possibly gone any better for America. In large part, even though Roosevelt wasn't out there, a big part of why we were so successful was because in the months leading up to it, he had our fleet very, very well prepared. And America did have a top-notch Navy. So, you know, we were very lethal out on the water. Now, the other part of the war that's happening about the same time, because like I said, this war only takes about 6 months or so. But the other battle that's totally unrelated to that one is we mount an invasion of Cuba. That's going to be done by the Army. Now, the American Navy was the second best Navy in the world back in this era. The American Army was like the 40th largest army on the planet, and our Army was not well prepared at all. Very backwards. We didn't have a big, large standing army. We didn't have a lot of professional soldiers at the time. So our Army and Navy back in this era, stark contrast, where one is top notch, the other not all that hot. We hadn't had a big army since the Civil War, which was like a generation before. Now, a lot of guys that had been young officers in the Civil War are like our generals now. So that's going to be, those are the guys that are kind of leading our army into combat. But we didn't have enough soldiers to really mount a good, successful invasion of Cuba. So we have to we don't pass a draft. We don't start making guys sign up for it, but we ask for volunteers. Now, Teddy Roosevelt, who had been the Secretary of the Navy, remember, going back to him, I'll get into the more detail on this in the Roosevelt notes, he felt like his dad, when he had opted out of fighting in the Civil War, had kind of smudged the family honor. And it had been his dream. He had been literally waiting for 20 years for his whole adult life, because he's in his 40s, early 40s at this time, for a war to break out. And he wants to fight and see combat. So even though he was the top guy in our Navy, he knows he's going to be sitting at a desk in Washington, D.C. So he, against the advice of all his political friends and his family, he resigns as Secretary of the Navy to become kind of an honorary Army officer at a much lower rank. He's going to be a lieutenant colonel. And they wouldn't give him soldiers because he wasn't a professional soldier. So it's not like they can just let this guy who's a politician come in and lead actual trained American troops. But they said, we will let you lead a regiment if you can round these guys up and recruit guys. So Roosevelt, who is kind of well known at the time, puts out an all call saying, any young American guys that are looking for action, you come join up with me. I'm putting together a regiment that's going to join the U.S. Army, and we're going to go kick some Spanish butt down in Cuba. He actually has a lot of guys join up. This group gets nicknamed the Rough Riders, all right? I forget the actual regimental designation or their number, but history knows them as Teddy Roosevelt and the Rough Riders, okay? This was a hodgepodge group of guys. There were cowboys, there were fugitives from the law that were trying to run away from sheriffs out west that were coming. He had some of his old college football buddies. There were some black guys in the unit, and this is back at a time when the Army was segregated. Blacks and whites could not serve together, but in this regiment, which was all volunteers, they kind of let it happen. He had Native American scouts. I mean, there were some people that were coal miners and teachers. You just had a really random hodgepodge group of guys that got thrown together with Roosevelt. They went through a couple weeks of training, and then, boom, they were loaded up on boats and off to Cuba. Now, Roosevelt, I'll give him a little credit here, because for most modern politicians, they'll do everything they can to not fight in wars. Bill Clinton allegedly dodged the draft during Vietnam. Donald Trump got 5 deferments. Barack Obama just never served. George W. Bush, he pulled some strings or had his dad do it. So during the Vietnam War, he didn't have to be active duty. He was actually just National Guard and wouldn't actually see combat. So all of our modern presidents, none of them have, been in combat. They've done everything they can to stay out of combat. Roosevelt, very different. At the first chance he had to fight in a war, he resigns his powerful political position, takes a lower rank, and wants to go out there and be in the front lines and command troops. He also knows that he is not formally trained. He's never been in combat before, so I give him credit for this. He could have led the regiment and been the top ranking officer in it, but he said, I don't want to do that. Make me be the number 2 guy. And he actually deferred to an old Civil War veteran who was going to be the general of that regiment, the guy that was running the show, or maybe he was a colonel. That's not really important. So Roosevelt's the number 2 ranking officer, and I guess as the fighting plays out, he does some incredible fighting, and he is a very brave, courageous soldier. He leads multiple charges up hills under Spanish machine gun fire. He has 2 horses shot out from under him. He brings a couple extra pair of glasses, and he breaks his glasses out there in the field multiple times. He is the first guy charging up the hill and saying, come on, boys, and he's running up there. He actually supposedly killed a couple Spaniards up in close combat as he shot him with his revolver. So an incredible guy. He actually said after the war that his one regret from the whole experience was that he didn't come away from the war with some really good scar he could show off the rest of his life. What an interesting guy, huh? He didn't want to die in the war or have any permanent damage, but he wished he would have got some big scar or some bullet wound or something he could show off. Anyway, it ends up being called a splendid little war because out in the Pacific and then in Cuba, these 2 main battles of the war, both are decisive wins for America. We put Spain down very, very quickly. Here to give you some imagery, I don't have any good photographs from these regiments, but this is what the American guys would have dressed like. So think Cuba, 90 miles south of Florida. It is hot and steamy, tropical there, and our Army largely just kind of dressed like you would have seen them dressed in the Civil War. Blue Union wool coats. A lot of Teddy Roosevelt's Rough Riders actually didn't even have uniforms. They just they had jackets and whatever they came with and different hats and stuff. But our actual regular Army units that were professional soldiers, they looked a lot like what guys you'd see in the Civil War. And those uniforms would have been really, really hot and steamy. The Spaniards are a little more well prepared for the tropical heat. They were wearing white cotton uniforms. This is what they would have kind of looked like at the time. Anyway, though, them being slightly more comfortable doesn't do them much good because we end up just kicking their butt down there in Spain. Actually, more Americans died from eating tainted, spoiled meat and getting gut infections and malaria than actually died from Spanish bullets. So all in all, the fighting went pretty darn good for us. Now, here's an important slide for you. This is the results of the Spanish-American War. So to wrap everything up, after those 2 battles, we're getting ready to go invade Puerto Rico, which is another Spanish territory. At that point, the Spaniards realize it's a lost cause. So they say, hands up. That battle never really ends up getting going. And they say, war's over, let's go negotiate. Now, the treaty is negotiated in Paris, France, which you might say, wait, what the heck? I thought we were fighting Spain. Why would the treaty get negotiated in France when they had nothing to do with it? Well, that's exactly why we negotiated there. France had nothing to do with it, so it was a neutral country that both sides could send representatives to and feel safe. So we meet in Paris. The French government kind of is like the arbitrator and moderates this. And you better believe that like the French, the Germans, the British, they're keeping a close eye on this. Even though they weren't involved in the fighting, this is the first time that America is going out and like kicking butt and beating up an old school European power. So it's kind of like they're definitely noticing this and a little bit uneasy because they're like, oh man, now we've got another big powerful country over there, America, who we've never really had to worry about in the past. And now they're coming onto the world stage and man, that might be trouble down the road. What we end up getting. Now, America, like I remember I talked about America's split personality, how we value our freedom and liberty and nobody else telling us what to do. We fought a revolution, broke away from the British for no taxation without representation. So it's kind of hypocritical to take other colonies, but we at the same time, we're an up and coming nation. We want to have challenges. There were a lot of people that were arguing America should be an empire and take colonies. So the imperialists kind of went out after this. And we end up, of the 4 colonies that Spain still had, we took 3 of them. So the Philippines, which is a chain of islands, you'd want to have this stuff. That's why I have it underlined there. We take the Philippines, chain of islands, kind of south of Japan. That becomes an American territory. We take Guam, which is a very tiny little island out in the Pacific, but it ends up being a great naval base. And then we take Puerto Rico, which Guam and Puerto Rico are actually still part of the United States today, but they're not states. Puerto Rico is a small little island in the Caribbean. That becomes a U.S. Commonwealth too. So it's like we supervise it. We have bases there, but they don't vote in U.S. presidential elections. They don't pay federal taxes. They're just a U.S. held territory, okay? Now, we end up paying Spain $20 million, even though we won all the battles. Basically, Spain was broke, and they've now totally lost their empire. So we give them $20 million to kind of help them pay to move all of their stuff off our new islands. So pretty small concession. For picking up those really key strategic bases, $20 million was a bargain. In today's money, that would probably be up like a couple $100 million. But like when you consider the whole federal budget, that's a drop in the bucket. Now, the place we wanted the most was actually Cuba. That was their biggest island. We had our eyes set on that for a long, long time. Actually, since the Civil War, America had been thinking, how in the heck can we get Cuba? We had been itching for that for a long time. We want to take it, but all of the other European countries are against it. They kind of, like the French, British, and the Spaniards, everybody kind of stacks up against us and says, no, we don't really want America getting this really key strategic island. Now, America was in a situation that, on the one hand, we wanted to have Cuba, but we could live with not getting Cuba for ourselves. What we could not live with is another European power coming in and taking it, because it's so close to Florida. It would have been a threat to U.S. security. So that would have been a deal breaker. If like somehow in the deal, like the French or the British or the Germans were going to take Cuba, we would have for sure gone to war over that. But we could live with Cuba becoming an independent nation, because we felt like, they're a small country. If it's just those Cuban rebels kind of running the show down there, they're not a threat to us. It'll be a neutral country that we don't really have to deal with, and kind of a buffer. So Cuba ends up becoming independent. And one thing that didn't really factor into the decision, but you would think it maybe should, the Cuban people, they overwhelmingly wanted to just be an independent country. They didn't want to be part of the United States or Spain or Great Britain or any of the other countries. They wanted their independence. So that ended up working out pretty good for them, I guess, how this war pans out. Now, there's one exception to Cuba, and you may have heard of this today. This is one of those things that it's a little bonus thing for you. If you watch this through to the end and are listening, everybody else that just skipped through it or just looked at the slides wouldn't get this info. We did pick up one naval base in Cuba, so it's on the island of Cuba, that the U.S. still controls to this day. But it's a very, very small hunk of land, a naval base called Guantanamo Bay. So how you spell that? Guantanamo, or you could Google it and spell check will get it for you. But we get Guantanamo Bay as a naval base, but really the rest of Cuba is independent. So that's the end of the notes I have for you today. That's how America starts to get its empire. After you finish this note, this section of notes, and if you hadn't already, I'd recommend you view the annexation of Hawaii ones and the America Becomes a World Power ones from about a week ago. Those three chunks, those three little lectures that I did for you, will all tie into the other quiz that's coming out on a separate posting today. So have your notes ready if you took any. Maybe if you didn't take notes, you might want to go back and do that, or at least rewatch those lectures. Everything on this quiz will tie into those three lecture videos we've done. All right, have a great day.